For purposes of clarification, you are one of the Schindler Jews, as they're called. In recent years, well, I won't limit it to just recent years, but I think it may be getting worse. You could argue that it's getting worse because of the advent of the internet. There's this ridiculous notion out there that the Holocaust never happened. It's a lie that won't stop. Where do you suppose this began? And secondly, when you're confronted with it, how can you deal with that?
I think denial of facts is almost a genetic program, and that is essentially part of that very interesting question that you have presented. Generally speaking, the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and it doesn't have to be a Holocaust, any power play at the expense of a weaker minority, whether it is a husband towards abused wife, or on a greater social level, the inclination is to grab, to exploit, which is exactly what happened in our Holocaust, material gains, and to silence the victims so that they cannot point an accusing finger by conditioning them. And also, if something is discovered, to try and sweep it under the carpet rather than deal with it as an issue. And we see that, let's say, with Enron, amongst other places. So power structure, the Holocausts are at many, many different levels, and each one contributes to a Holocaust culture that ignites into an unexpected situation, such as 60 years ago or in many of the other places. And it's a historic fact that it keeps coming around, and it will come around as well, unless we work at it. And the encouraging thing is that half the world population have accepted an aspect of this freedom of the individual, democratic philosophy of the Hebrew Bible through Christianity. And it brings hope, because half the world population is heading that way, but we still have a long way to go.
You've made this interesting identification of a Holocaust culture. What are some of the warning signs from your perspective?
Selfishness that is intolerant, that disdains the sanctity of life in general, and of course aggressive selfishness. And that can express itself in every walk of life you can have, whether it is, it even expresses itself in the structure of religions. Not just corporations, and not just tribal expressions, and not fanatic expressions that we see in the exploiting God, selfishly exploiting God for the sake of, again, greedy self-interest. All those are elements of a tendency towards a Holocaust culture which really surrounds us, and unless we take a sort of a social action, it encroaches on us, and 9/11 is a great example of that. We need to get the family together, the society together, to work together, to cooperate, to love thy neighbor as thyself. By the way, the Hebrew origin of it is love thy friend and thy enemy as thyself. It's been translated into the simpler form, but the implication that you should also attempt to have a fair dealing with your enemy is something which originated 2,600 years ago, and it's still totally relevant today.
Tell us a little bit about the development of this presentation that you're making. You've been doing this for a while. How did this come about, where you find yourself at universities and other places explaining to people your experience and your story?
It came to me as a total surprise. If somebody told me that I would be a public speaker, I would have laughed at them, because I was a victim of the silencing. And I relate in my presentation the psychological process of silence being imposed on a child of 10 in a very traumatic and dramatic way. At first, when I saw the film, I felt elated, because I felt it represented an essential truth of my own experience. And I wanted people to see that. And therefore, I even called my community and I said, hey, I'm a survivor, I would like to speak out. Well, they didn't take much of a response to that. But one day I was at a dinner and there was a man next to me, and he started telling me about his son who worked for a lecture bureau. So I said, that would be interesting, because I would like to speak out as a survivor. Anyway, 3 hours later I got home, and his son called from New York, and since then I have been speaking to probably about 250,000, mostly students, who are a perfect audience because they're not yet fixed in these inflexible ways of thinking of the older generation. So we have these dynamics and questions, and I don't attempt to solve any problems, because I don't think that is really possible. But by relating a personal experience, say, hey, think about society and life and children and yourself in those relationships. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think is the most consistent question that has always been asked concerning my experience in the Holocaust?
Sadly, my first thought would be, how do you deal with Holocaust deniers? Or have you ever been confronted by a Holocaust denier?
We'll get to that. But the thing that really fascinated me, and this is an answer to your previous question that I learned about, was that on every occasion there was a question, what happened to your mother? How can a child function without the support and so on of the mother and that relation? Every time. And there were thousands of other questions as well. You want me to address the deniers? That was also an education for me, because I was totally convinced that I've spoken in places that I knew that there were Holocaust deniers in the audience. I have a photograph of two guys that make me look like a midget, and I'm not all that small. Huge guys. After the lecture, after the presentation, I discovered that they were my bodyguards. I think it was in Indiana somewhere. The feature is that it's really the motivation of who is the Holocaust denier. And what happens is that the Holocaust denier's policy is to exploit a weaker minority. And he wants support for that, both in terms of supporters, financial support, and exposure to his point of view. The last place he's likely to get those things that he wants selfishly, aggressively, and greedily is in an audience that comes voluntarily to speak, to hear of a Holocaust survivor. So it was once again the audience that protected me on every one of the occasions during the last 12 years. It may change, but so far it's been pretty good.
I certainly don't mean to monopolize anybody. Jump in.
Okay.
By the way, if I may interrupt, I thought your questions were terrific. I really enjoyed your questions. They're very thoughtful. And
thank you, sir.